She married a quiet human, then saw him draw his blade. Every bond was measured, discussed, and approved by councils long before feelings were ever considered. Lureth had accepted that truth from an early age. She was born into a respected house, educated in law and diplomacy, and trained to speak with calm authority. Her future, like everything else, was supposed to be useful. That was why her decision confused everyone. The human named Elias Ward did not fit into any plan. He was not wealthy by Keller standards. He did not command fleets or control trade routes. He did not even speak often. He served as a cultural attaché, a quiet position that required patience more than power. Most people forgot he was in the room unless they needed a translation or an old record explained. And yet, Lureth chose him. When she announced her intent to marry Elias, the reaction was not anger. It was something worse. Silence filled the council chamber, thick and uncomfortable. Elders exchanged glances. Advisors checked data screens as if an error might explain her words. A human. Not a human leader. Not a strategist, just a man. Lureth stood firm. Her posture was calm, her voice steady. She explained that the union met all legal requirements. There were no violations of custom. Humans were recognized members of the wider galactic community. There was no law against the bond. The council could not stop her. They could only question her judgment. Elias himself did not argue, did not smile with pride, and did not boast. When asked if he understood the responsibility of marrying into a Keller house, he simply said yes. When asked what he offered in return, he said loyalty. That answer disappointed many. Lureth noticed something else. While others focused on status and advantage, Elias watched the room. His eyes moved slowly, taking in reactions, expressions, and subtle shifts in tone. He did not look nervous, he looked attentive. That was the first thing that made her certain. Their marriage was simple by Keller standards. There were no grand displays, no dramatic speeches. Elias wore formal human clothing, plain and dark, with no symbols beyond a small metal band on his finger. Lureth wore her family colors, though without the heavy ceremonial armor reserved for political unions. Observers expected awkwardness. They expected misunderstanding. Instead, the two moved together with surprising ease. Elias learned Keller customs quickly. He never interrupted. He listened carefully before speaking. He asked questions only when needed, and he remembered the answers. When he made mistakes, he corrected them quietly without drawing attention to himself. Many assumed this was weakness. Lureth knew better. They settled on a frontier world, a place balanced between human space and Keller territory. The planet was calm, distant from the crowded core systems. It had long days, wide skies, and cities built with patience rather than urgency. Their home overlooked a slow river. Elias spent hours there, reading old physical books instead of using faster data slates. Sometimes he cooked meals from Earth, carefully adapting ingredients to Keller biology. Other times he simply sat in silence, watching the water move. He did not talk about his past. When Lureth asked, he answered honestly but briefly. He had served in several diplomatic missions. He had studied history, especially periods of collapse and recovery. He had lived through events that required patience more than action. He did not speak of glory. There was one thing he never explained, a narrow case he kept secured in their private quarters. It was not large, not reinforced, and not hidden, but it was always locked. When asked, Elias simply said it was old and important. Lureth respected the boundary. Life settled into a rhythm. Lureth continued her duties as a representative of the Keller Union. Elias assisted quietly, reviewing documents, checking translations, and pointing out small details others overlooked. His comments were often short, sometimes just a sentence, but they mattered. "Check the footnote," he once said during a minor trade discussion. The footnote revealed a clause that would have cost the Union years of resource access. After that, people listened a little more closely when Elias spoke. Still, most dismissed him as background. He did not seek influence. He did not build a following. When praised, he redirected attention. When criticized, he accepted it without protest. Some found that unsettling. Months passed. Then came the announcement. A delegation from the Interstellar Compact would arrive to renegotiate territorial definitions near the frontier. The compact was old, powerful, and very confident in its authority. Their representatives were known for using tradition and complex law to achieve what force was not allowed to do. Lureth prepared carefully. She reviewed historical treaties, consulted advisors, and coordinated hospitality. The event would be formal, binding, and watched closely by many systems. Elias read every document. Late one evening, Lureth noticed him rereading a section of compact ceremonial law. His expression was thoughtful, his fingers resting lightly on the page. "Something wrong?" she asked. He considered before answering. "Not wrong," he said, "just familiar." She raised an eyebrow. "Familiar how? Patterns repeat," Elias replied. "Especially when people believe no one remembers the old ones." He said no more. The day of the convocation arrived. The hall was filled with dignitaries, translators, observers, and recorders. Symbols of alliance were displayed carefully, each placed according to tradition. The compact delegation arrived with perfect timing and confident posture. At first the talks were polite. Words were exchanged, gifts presented, and compliments offered. Then the tone shifted. The compact representatives began invoking older customs, very old ones, ritual phrases long unused. Lureth felt unease as each declaration layered obligation upon obligation. None of it was openly hostile. None of it broke law. It was worse than that. They were binding her people through precedent. Lureth responded carefully, but she could feel the trap closing. The room watched her closely. A mistake here would echo for generations. She glanced at Elias. He was no longer reading. He was listening. When the compact lead speaker completed a ceremonial phrase that sealed the proposed framework, Elias moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. He stepped forward beside Lureth. Murmurs spread. A human was not expected to interrupt such proceedings. Elias did not speak at first. Instead, he reached for the narrow case he had brought with him. The same case Lureth had seen countless times, always closed, always silent. He unlocked it. The sound was soft, but the room noticed. Slowly, Elias opened the case and lifted what lay inside. It was a blade, simple, unmarked, clean, not raised, not pointed, just held. The room fell silent. Lureth felt her breath catch, not in fear but in surprise. She had never seen the object before. It did not radiate threat. It radiated history. Elias held it carefully like something fragile. "I recognize the custom you have invoked," he said calmly. "And so does this." Several members of the compact stiffened. Data screens flickered. Whispers broke out among historians and legal observers. Elias did not move closer. He did not issue demands. He simply stood there, blade visible, waiting. Lureth looked at him then, truly looked, and understood something she had not before. He had never been quiet because he was weak. He had been quiet because he was waiting. And whatever that blade meant, it meant that humanity had never forgotten how to wait. The silence did not break quickly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The great hall felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Lureth could hear her own breathing, slow but unsteady. Every eye had shifted from the compact delegation to the human standing beside her. Elias did not change his posture. The blade rested in his hand, angled slightly downward, not threatening, not hidden. It reflected the light of the hall in a soft, steady line. One of the compact legal historians leaned forward, their frills stiff with tension. Data aides whispered urgently, pulling up records that had not been accessed in centuries. The lead compact speaker's confident expression faltered, replaced by calculation. "This proceeding is not a martial forum," the speaker said carefully. "Weapons are not permitted." Elias nodded once. "Agreed," he said. "This is not a weapon." That answer unsettled the room more than defiance would have. Lureth turned slightly toward him. "Elias," she said quietly, not as an order, not as a rebuke. "Explain." He met her gaze for a brief moment, something warm and steady passing between them. Then he looked back at the assembly. "What you invoked," Elias said, "was a pre-expansion compact binding custom, one designed for civilizations that believed survival meant control." Several elders shifted uncomfortably. "You believe it still applies," he continued, "because no one has challenged it in living memory." The compact speaker straightened. "Custom holds unless law repeals it." "Yes," Elias said calmly, "unless counter-law was embedded at the same time." Murmurs grew louder. Elias turned the blade slightly so its flat side faced the delegation. Along its surface, faint markings became visible under the hall's lighting. They were not decorative. They were precise. Lureth felt a sudden realization strike her. These were not symbols of war. They were records. "This," Elias said, "is a covenant marker, issued when humanity was admitted into early interstellar frameworks, before we had fleets to impress anyone, before we had influence." The compact historian's voice shook slightly. "Those markers were ceremonial." "Largely symbolic." "Yes," Elias replied, "symbols last longer than empires." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply explained. "When humanity entered the wider galaxy, we were weak," he said. "We knew it. We also knew that power changes hands faster than memory fades, so we negotiated something small." He paused, letting the words settle. "We asked for recognition that when certain ancient customs were invoked against us or our allies, this marker could be presented. Not to threaten, but to remind." Lureth felt her pulse quicken. She was no longer just a participant. She was a witness to something far older than her people's current position. "Remind of what?" one observer asked quietly. Elias looked toward them. "That survival does not require dominance," he said. "It requires persistence and record-keeping." The compact delegation began to speak among themselves, their calm discipline cracking. Data streams updated rapidly. Clauses long buried surfaced again, glowing on screens like ghosts. The lead speaker raised a hand. "This interpretation is disputed." "Of course," Elias said. "It always is. That is why the marker exists." He gently returned the blade to the case but did not close it. The object remained visible, undeniable. Lureth felt the pressure ease slightly, not because the danger had passed, but because the rules of the game had changed. The compact attempted to recover. They proposed recess. They suggested review committees. They framed delays as mutual respect. Elias did not object. He stepped back beside Lureth, his role apparently complete. But Lureth knew better now. During the recess, the hall buzzed with restrained chaos. Delegates clustered together, speaking in hushed tones. Observers transmitted updates to distant systems. The story was already spreading. Lureth turned to Elias once they were briefly alone near the observation window. "You could have told me," she said softly. "I wanted to," he replied, "but it only matters when it matters." She studied him. "How long have humans planned like this?" He considered the question. "Since the first time we almost disappeared." That answer chilled her more than any threat. The convocation resumed, but its tone had shifted completely. The compact delegation was no longer in control. Every proposal they made was carefully examined. Every tradition they cited was cross-referenced. What had once been a smooth trap became a field of caution. By the end of the day, no binding decision was reached. That alone was a victory. As the hall emptied, many eyes followed Elias, some with curiosity, some with unease, some with a new respect they did not yet understand. Back at their home, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Lureth finally spoke the question that had been waiting. "What is that blade really?" Elias placed the case on the table and opened it fully. The blade rested inside, simple and worn in places where hands had held it across generations. "It is proof," he said. "Proof that humans learned early that shouting attracts attention, but silence gathers information." He traced one of the faint markings. Each mark represents a moment when humanity chose endurance over retaliation. Lureth's voice was barely above a whisper. "How many moments?" Elias smiled faintly. "Enough." She looked at him, truly seeing him now, not as a quiet partner, not as a political anomaly, but as something deeper. "You married into danger," she said. "No," he replied. "I married into trust." That night, messages arrived from across the frontier. Allies requested clarification. Rivals requested reassurance. Some requested copies of ancient law. Human channels, long quiet, became active, not with threats but with documentation. Lureth realized then that humanity's strength was not hidden weapons or secret armies. It was memory, and memory, once awakened, could reshape entire regions of space. Elias returned the blade to its case and locked it. "For now," he said. Lureth nodded, knowing that the universe had just learned something important. Humans did not need to raise their voices. They only needed to remind the stars that they were still here. The days after the convocation passed with a strange weight hanging over the frontier world. Nothing exploded, no fleets moved, no threats were spoken aloud. And yet, Lureth could feel change pressing in from every direction, like a tide that had turned without sound. Messages arrived constantly. Some were polite requests for clarification. Others were cautious inquiries disguised as friendly concern. A few were openly nervous, asking whether the compact's authority had been permanently damaged. Lureth answered what she could. When she was unsure, she turned to Elias. He never rushed his responses. He read every message carefully, sometimes more than once. He compared wording, tone, and history. Often he answered with a single suggestion. "Say less," he would advise, or "acknowledge but don't explain." At first she found this frustrating. Keller diplomacy valued clarity and precision, but she began to notice something. The less they said, the more others revealed. The compact released a public statement framing the convocation as inconclusive but respectful. It avoided mentioning the blade. It avoided mentioning ancient customs. That omission spoke louder than accusation. Within days, independent legal scholars began publishing analyses. Long-forgotten treaties resurfaced. References to early human participation in galactic law appeared in places few remembered to look. Lureth sat in her office one evening, reviewing a historical archive Elias had quietly forwarded to her terminal. It detailed humanity's early years among the stars. They had not arrived as conquerors. They had arrived as survivors. Worlds lost to environmental collapse. Colonies abandoned to preserve lives rather than pride. Entire systems left behind because staying would have meant extinction. And through all of it, humans recorded everything. Failures, mistakes, broken agreements, promises kept too late. "They wrote this knowing they might not be here to benefit from it," Lureth said softly. Elias stood by the window, watching the river glow faintly under the setting sun. "That's why it works," he replied. "Power assumes it will always exist. Memory doesn't." Requests for meetings followed. Not demands, not threats. Requests. Representatives from neutral systems wanted to better understand human precedent. Some asked whether similar covenant markers existed elsewhere. Others wanted to know if humanity intended to challenge more ancient customs. Elias declined most of them. "We don't teach by lecturing," he said. "We teach by example." Lureth noticed that the compact did not contact them directly. That silence worried her more than open confrontation. One night, long after the city had quieted, Lureth found Elias seated at the table with the blade's case open again. He was not holding it this time. He was reading a thin data strip resting beside it. "Is something coming?" she asked. He looked up slowly. "Something adjusting," he said. "Which is more dangerous?" He explained that the compact was not unified. It never had been. Its power depended on shared belief in its authority. When that belief weakened, internal fractures widened. "They won't strike," he said. "They'll redefine." Redefinition was subtle. It was law rewritten to appear fair. It was committees formed to delay. It was influence redirected quietly. Lureth felt a familiar tightening in her chest. "And humanity? We wait," Elias said. The next development came unexpectedly. A delegation from a minor system arrived unannounced. Their leader, an aging diplomat named Seresh, requested a private audience with Elias, not with Lureth, with Elias. Lureth observed the meeting from a discreet distance, though she could hear everything. Seresh was nervous but not fearful. "We didn't know," Seresh admitted, "about the markers, about the clauses." "No one was supposed to," Elias replied gently. "Then why let us see it now?" Elias paused. "Because someone crossed a line that affects more than us." Seresh hesitated. "Others are afraid you'll use this leverage." Elias smiled faintly. "Leverage implies pressure. This is gravity. It only works if you're already standing somewhere unstable." The metaphor seemed to settle something in Seresh's mind. When the diplomat left, Lureth approached Elias. "You speak as if this was inevitable." "It was," he said. "Systems grow comfortable. Comfort leads to shortcuts. Shortcuts repeat history." She studied him. "And humans are here to remind everyone." "No," he said. "We're here to make sure no one gets erased quietly." That answer stayed with her. News from the compact finally arrived, but not as a message. As a proposal released publicly across multiple channels. A unified legal reaffirmation, they called it. It claimed to modernize ancient customs, making them fairer and more adaptable. On the surface, it looked reasonable. Elias read it once, then again. "This is clever," he admitted. Lureth's pulse quickened. "Clever enough to work. Clever enough to fail slowly," he said. He pointed out the flaws. The reaffirmation attempted to override embedded counterclauses by redefining their scope. It avoided direct conflict with human law while undermining its application. "It assumes humans will argue loudly," Elias said, "or demand recognition. And you won't." "No," he replied. "We'll archive." Within days, human legal teams began publishing annotated versions of the reaffirmation. Not condemnations, not protests, annotations. Each line was linked to historical context. Each redefinition was compared to precedent. Each omission was highlighted gently. The galaxy watched as the compact's own words became evidence against them. Lureth realized then that humans were not fighting the compact. They were letting it speak. Privately, she struggled with something else. Her people began to treat Elias differently. Some showed open respect. Others showed suspicion. A few accused Lureth of being manipulated. She confronted him one evening, frustration finally breaking through her calm. "Did you plan this marriage?" she asked. Elias did not react defensively. He did not look hurt. He looked thoughtful. "No," he said honestly, "I hoped for it, but I didn't plan it." "Why hope?" "Because you listen," he replied, "and because you choose people over structures." Her anger faded, replaced by a quiet ache. "And if I hadn't, then someone else would have stood beside the marker when the time came." She nodded slowly. "You don't centralize power." "Centralized power is easy to remove," Elias said. Weeks passed. The compact's reaffirmation stalled in committee. Systems delayed endorsement. Questions multiplied. Confidence drained away. The frontier world became a crossroads of conversation, not conflict, conversation. Lureth watched as alliances shifted subtly, not because of fear of humanity, but because of trust in process. One evening, as stars brightened above the river, Lureth asked Elias a question that had been forming for some time. "What happens when the blade is no longer needed?" he considered. "Then it returns to waiting. And if someone tries to destroy it?" He smiled slightly. Then they misunderstand it completely. She laughed softly, surprising herself. For the first time since the convocation, she felt something like hope instead of vigilance. The universe had not become safer, but it had become more honest. And somewhere deep in the currents of law and memory, humanity remained what it had always been. Not loud, not dominant, just impossible to erase. The change did not arrive with celebration. There were no grand announcements, no declarations of victory, no sudden shifts in borders or authority. Instead, the galaxy seemed to slow down, as if many systems had decided to breathe more carefully. Lureth noticed it first in the tone of messages. Where once communications had been confident, even demanding, they now carried caution. Where once ancient law had been cited as final truth, it was now presented as a question. Words like review, context, and mutual understanding appeared again and again. The frontier world became a place of listening. Delegations arrived not to negotiate power, but to understand risk. They wanted to know how close they were to repeating mistakes they no longer remembered making. Lureth hosted them all. She spoke clearly, but she did not reassure too much. Elias advised restraint. If you promise safety, he told her, they stop thinking, let them think. So she did. She listened to concerns, she acknowledged fear, she avoided absolutes. And slowly something unfamiliar began to grow. Trust. Not trust in authority, but trust in process. One afternoon, as Lurieth reviewed reports from outer systems, she paused at a strange pattern. Several worlds had independently suspended old enforcement customs tied to the compact. None announced it publicly. None blamed anyone. They simply stopped. She showed the data to Elias. They're afraid, she asked. Some, he said. Others are relieved. Relieved of what? Of pretending they agreed with rules they inherited but never chose. That answer stayed with her. The compact, meanwhile, was unraveling quietly, not collapsing, not fracturing openly. Unraveling, committees requested extensions. Representatives contradicted one another in small ways. Legal frameworks that had once fit together smoothly began to clash at the edges. The compact had built its strength on continuity, on the belief that what had always been would always be. Humanity had introduced doubt. And doubt, once planted, did not need encouragement to grow. One evening, Lureth received a secure transmission marked with priority. It came from a high-ranking compact mediator she had dealt with years before. The message was careful, polite, personal. It asked for a private meeting. Lureth read it twice, then handed it to Elias. They're reaching out, she said. Yes, he replied, not to negotiate, to understand whether they can still exist. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground, a station that floated between jurisdictions and rarely hosted anything of importance. That alone spoke volumes. The mediator arrived without entourage, without ceremony. Their posture was tired rather than proud. We misjudged, they said after the formalities ended. Lureth waited. We believed memory belonged to those in power, the mediator continued. We believed those without influence would forget. Elias spoke softly. Forgetting is a luxury. The mediator nodded slowly. What does humanity want? Elias did not answer immediately. Lureth felt the weight of the question press against her. This was the moment many civilizations would reveal ambition. Elias surprised her. We want systems to survive their own mistakes, he said. The mediator blinked. That is not a demand. No, Elias agreed. It's a warning. The mediator left without agreement, but also without hostility. Afterward, as the station's lights dimmed and stars drifted silently past, Lureth turned to Elias. You could have asked for guarantees, she said. Guarantees break, he replied. Habits change. Back on the frontier world, life continued with careful normality. Lureth noticed how people looked at Elias now, not with fear, not with worship, but with curiosity. They asked him questions, not about the blade, but about history, about patience, about how humanity survived so many losses without hardening into cruelty. He answered when he could. When you lose everything, he told a group of young diplomats, you learn what is actually necessary. Most power structures don't make the list. Lureth watched him from a distance during those moments. She felt pride, but also something quieter and more personal. She realized she was still discovering the man she had married. One night, unable to sleep, she joined Elias by the river. The water moved steadily, unchanged by politics or law. "Do you ever get tired of waiting?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Waiting is rest compared to running." She studied his expression. "What are you afraid of?" He did not answer immediately. "That will be mistaken for saviors," he said finally. "Saviors create dependency. We're trying to create resilience." She nodded, understanding more deeply now. As weeks passed, the compact released another statement. This one acknowledged the need for collective historical review. It invited participation from all recognized species, including humanity. The galaxy reacted with surprise. Humanity accepted, not with celebration, not with demands, with archivists. Human representatives arrived carrying records, not arguments. They shared data freely, even where it revealed human failures, especially where it revealed human failures. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Other civilizations began contributing their own forgotten histories. Mistakes surfaced, patterns emerged, old wounds were acknowledged. The process was slow, uncomfortable, necessary. Lureth realized then that the blade had done its work long before it was ever drawn. It had reminded the galaxy that no system was eternal. One evening, as they reviewed updates together, Lureth asked a question that had been forming quietly inside her. What happens when humanity no longer needs to be the reminder? Elias closed the terminal and looked at her fully. "Then we'll have succeeded," he said, "and we'll go back to being unremarkable." She laughed softly. "You were never unremarkable." He shook his head. "That's the goal." She reached for his hand, feeling the familiar steadiness there. "I think," she said slowly, "that many species are realizing something important." "What's that?" "That strength doesn't always announce itself," she replied. "Sometimes it waits until it's needed, and sometimes it chooses to love instead of rule." Elias squeezed her hand gently. The universe had not changed overnight, but it had begun to remember, and in that remembering humanity stood exactly where it always had, quiet, patient. Unmovable, the galaxy did not change all at once. There was no single moment when everything became fair or peaceful, no final agreement that fixed history forever. Instead, change spread the same way it always had, quietly. Lureth understood this better now. She had seen power before. She had studied it, negotiated with it, and lived inside its rules. But what she was watching now was different. It was not power pushing outward. It was balance pulling inward. The Great Review Council began its work. Human archivists sat beside scholars from dozens of species. Old treaties were read again, slowly this time. Context was restored where it had been stripped away. Intent was examined, not just outcome. Mistakes were not hidden. That was what unsettled so many. Civilizations were used to presenting their victories. Humanity presented its failures. They spoke openly of lost worlds, broken promises, and decisions that saved lives but cost pride. They did not excuse themselves. They did not demand forgiveness. They simply recorded the truth, and truth, once shared, had weight. Lureth watched from her position as both participant and observer. She noticed how often eyes turned to Elias, not for approval but for reassurance. He rarely spoke unless asked. When he did, his words were careful. "We're not here to judge," he said once. "We're here so no one has to pretend they don't remember." Slowly, resistance softened. Some compact representatives resigned quietly. Others adapted. A few openly admitted they had relied on tradition because it was easier than accountability. The compact itself did not fall. It changed. Its authority became conditional. Its customs became reviewable. Its power became something that had to be earned again and again. Many saw this as weakness. Lureth saw it as survival. One evening, after a long session filled with difficult admissions, Lureth and Elias walked back along the river path near their home. The lights of the city reflected on the water, breaking into shifting lines. "Do you think they'll resent humans for this?" she asked. "Some already do," Elias replied. "Resentment isn't dangerous by itself. Silence is," she nodded. The frontier world had changed too. It had become a place people talked about, not as a capital, not as a stronghold, but as a place where things had been reconsidered. Visitors came often. Some just wanted to see where the blade had been drawn. Others wanted to understand the people behind it. They were often surprised. They found no monuments, no banners, no guarded relics. Just people living ordinary lives. That was the part most could not understand. One afternoon, a young Keller aide asked Lureth a question she had once asked herself. "Why didn't humanity use this leverage earlier?" the aide asked. "They could have reshaped everything." Lureth thought of Elia's reading by the river, of the quiet case resting untouched for decades, of a species that had survived by choosing restraint again and again. "Because reshaping everything too fast breaks it," she said, "and because humans didn't want to rule the galaxy. They wanted to live in it." As months passed, the blade remained locked away. No one asked Elias to draw it again. That, more than anything, told Lureth they had succeeded. The final act came not with confrontation but with choice. The compact formally retired several of its oldest binding customs. They replaced them with review mechanisms that required consent instead of compliance. The announcement was careful, measured, but it echoed across the stars. Civilizations that had lived under quiet pressure felt something loosen, not freedom, breathing room. On the day the announcement became public, Lureth returned home early. She found Elias in the garden, repairing a small irrigation unit with patient care. "It's done," she said. He looked up, smiled gently, and returned to his work. "Good. That's all you have to say," he shrugged lightly. "Endings are just pauses with better timing." She laughed, a sound full of relief and warmth. That night they sat together beneath the open sky. The stars were distant and indifferent as they had always been, but Lureth felt less small beneath them now. "You never told me what happens to the Covenant markers," she said. Elias leaned back, looking upward. "They're returned, stored, sometimes passed down, mostly forgotten. And this one," he said, "goes back to waiting." She considered that. "Until the next time, hopefully," he replied. "There won't be a next time." She reached for his hand. "And if there is, then someone quiet will stand up again." Time moved forward. Lureth's role changed. She became a guide more than a negotiator. Younger diplomats sought her advice. She taught them to listen more than speak, to study history before rewriting it. Elias returned to quieter work. Translation, archival support. Occasionally, someone would recognize him and pause, unsure how to speak to the man who had changed so much without force. He always treated them the same, kindly. Years later, long after the urgency had faded, Lureth found herself standing in the council chamber where it had all begun. A new generation filled the seats. The air felt lighter. A minor dispute was being discussed. Nothing dangerous, nothing historic. And yet she noticed something. No one tried to trap anyone with forgotten law. No one assumed authority without explanation. Memory had become part of the system. When the session ended, Lureth returned home to find Elias reading by the window as he always had. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, surprised. "Regret what?" "Letting the galaxy see what humanity prepared," she said. "It changed everything." He closed the book gently. "No," he said, "because we didn't show strength, we showed restraint. That's harder to misuse." She sat beside him. "You know what they say now, don't you?" He smiled. "I've heard a few versions. They say humans don't conquer," she continued. "They endure, And when they finally stand, it's not to take something. It's to make sure no one disappears quietly. Elias looked thoughtful. That's not a bad reputation. She rested her head against his shoulder. In the vast, indifferent universe, humanity had not claimed the stars. They had claimed memory. And through memory, they had earned something far rarer than power, a future. The blade remained locked away, unraised, exactly where it belonged, waiting.